Kia ora. I'm Barbara Brookes. Can you hear me now? And I'm here to convince you that knowing your history makes a difference. And I want you to think about the last month in Charlottesville, Virginia, where there was a riot over the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee. And one person died. So we had two sides absolutely against each other because of a fact of history. And what was that fact? In 1924, the community of Charlottesville, Virginia, thought they wanted to erect a statue to a hero who had defended their state, who had defended slavery. But in 2017, people in Charlottesville, West Virginia, didn't want to defend their record of defending slavery anymore because they felt that Black Lives Matter. So history, I want to convince you, is at the absolute crux of current debates in our world. And I want to do that by taking you through some historical events. Firstly, history is about understanding situations. And in order to do that, we have to divest ourselves of our current preoccupations and our current understandings of the world. It's a bit like being a traveller and going into a foreign country and not knowing what the rules and regulations are. So when I was a young person, I did my historical research, my first project in the mid-1970s, on abortion. This is an image from the 1950s. My research was actually on the 1930s, and I was a young person of the pill-taking generation in 1976. And I thought how interesting it would be to find out why people were concerned about abortion in the 1930s. And so I talked to women who had formed a group in the 1930s called the Sex, Hygiene and Birth Regulation Society. And when their group advertised in the paper got it wrong and advertised them as the Sex, Hygiene and Girth Regulation Society. Now, I thought that I knew about abortion. Abortion was a surgical procedure. But I found when I talked to these women, they didn't use that language. And my language is inadequate. And I had to divest myself of my current preoccupations. So I learned to say to them, how many children did you have? And they'd say, oh, I had 3 or 4. And I would say, well, how did you manage that? And they would say, oh, well, I brought on my period. So they had a very different understanding of what abortion meant. It meant those drugs they took, or it meant that instrumental interference in pregnancy that they did, but it wasn't a surgical procedure, which I had in my mind. So what does this tell us about change and about the past? It tells us that people will regulate their family size according to socio-economic circumstances. The 1930s was a time of depression. People couldn't afford another child. So even though they didn't have the recourse to the highly effective contraception we might have today, they made sure they limited their families. So history is also about time. And my second foray into historical research was into a very different time and into a different country. I worked on the history of ideas in revolutionary France in the late 18th century. And in that ferment of ideas where people were excitedly discussing liberty, equality, and fraternity, wanting to overthrow monarchy and create democracy, I found the voice of a woman called Olympe de Gouges. And she wrote that women should have the same rights of citizenship as men. They should be able to vote. They should be citizens. They should have a role in the state. And for those very radical ideas, she lost her life by the guillotine in 1793. This is actually Marie Antoinette, the Queen, losing her head by the guillotine, which was invented in the French Revolution. So what did we learn from this? We learn about the power of ideas. Her radical ideas led to her losing her head. So why was it that this idea that women should have equality as political citizens was so dangerous? It was such a dangerous idea that women in France, in fact, did not receive the right to vote until 1945. So that may cause us to reflect, why was it that women in New Zealand got the right to vote in 1893? And why is it that women in Saudi Arabia only got the right to vote in 2011 and voted for the first time in 2015? My third point I want to make about the importance of understanding the past is, in fact, understanding. This project took me into the history of mental health. Now, we all have ideas, I think, about buildings like this. This is the Seacliff Asylum, built in the 1880s, a large, imposing building. It was called the Lunatic Asylum, and lunatic is a word we would no longer use. We would no longer incarcerate people in buildings like this. So my question was, who went into this building in the 1880s, the 1890s, and the 1910s? And the answer to my question was that they were people in great distress, and they were taken to this building by their loved ones, by husbands, by wives, by children, because they hoped that they would receive some treatment in the latest facility designed to deal with sufferers from mental health. There were even some people who wrote to the medical superintendent asking to be taken in. A young woman wrote from Southland. She was pregnant outside of wedlock. She said never had a girl been treated so bad by her community, and that she wanted Frederick Truby King to take her into the asylum so she could raise her child, because she knew that he was the saviour of mothers and babies. So what did I learn from this project? I learned that the medical superintendent spent most of his days writing letters to ask that the sewer pipes which were broken under the building be repaired. Letters requesting more than 3 baths for hundreds of patients, and letters requesting that there be some form of amusement for these patients. So it was not the medical superintendent who created a grim and tragic asylum, but it was the government who didn't want to provide resources, and it was taxpayers like you and me who didn't want to contribute those resources and who wanted to put mental health out on the fringes of our society, who failed those who were mentally ill. History is also about the future. So I want to think about that. Unless we know the past, we cannot know the future. So if we think about abortion, for example, we might feel very pleased that women no longer have to resort to drugs, to knitting needles, in one instance, a meat hook, to restore their periods, that they now might have access to surgical abortion. On the other hand, we can also see that the tragedy of their situation in the 1930s led them to organise. They developed the Sex Hygiene and Birth Regulation Society, which became the forerunner of family planning in New Zealand. They also developed the Abortion Law Reform Association to agitate for social change. If we think about the French Revolution, we think about the importance of ideas, and we think about ideas that we might want to fight for. We may now have the vote, we may have some form of equality, but we also have other problems in the world, such as global warming, that we may want to make our voices heard. So the history of ideas teaches us that people can create social change and we can create a new future. If we think about mental illness, we could think and ponder on the word asylum. Asylum meant a refuge, a place of respite. And we might think that we might like to provide a refuge and a place of respite for people who are in great distress. It might suggest to us another mode of treatment from the chains of drugs which we now use to incarcerate the mentally ill. So history, I think, helps us see new futures. And history is also full of surprises. It's easy to forget, for example, that before 1986, homosexuality was illegal. What kind of society were we in then? Before 1977, there were separate job advertisements in newspapers. So if you're a man, there was the male wanted column. If you're a woman, there was the female wanted column. What distinguished them? Wages and the types of occupations. In the 1950s, when New Zealand had a buoyant economy, it was said that the Minister of Labour knew the names of the 5 unemployed people in the country. So knowing our history suggests to us that things were once very different. And it opens our imaginations to think how the future could be very different. And that's why I think knowing your history makes a difference. Thank you.